Between 1853 and 1854, white overseers vanished without a trace from plantations along the Ogeechee River in southeastern Georgia. Local newspapers never mentioned these disappearances. A county record each man as relocated or moved west. But in the slave quarters of Burke County, whispered stories told a different truth. Stories of a pale figure moving through darkness, of screams echoing from cypress groves, and of skin found stretched and curing like leather in hidden places deep within the swamps. The enslaved population called him Devil's White, speaking his name only in the quietest moments when overseers were beyond earshot. Burke County, Georgia in the early 1850s was a landscape of brutal contradictions. The Ogeechee River carved through dense forests of cypress and tupelo, creating a maze of swamps and tributaries that planters had learned to harness for rice cultivation. The county sat in the heart of Georgia's Black Belt, where enslaved people outnumbered white residents by margins of 10 to 1 in some districts. Cotton ruled the uplands, rice dominated the lowland swamps, and human bondage made both possible. The Calhoun plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of this unforgiving terrain. Jeremiah Calhoun had inherited the property from his father in 1847, along with 237 enslaved people whose names appeared in his ledgers as mere livestock entries. Calhoun himself rarely visited the property, preferring his townhouse in Savannah where he could conduct business and maintain the social standing expected of Georgia's planter class. The actual management of his property fell to a succession of overseers, white men typically drawn from the poor farming class who saw the position as their one opportunity to exercise power over others. The work on the Calhoun plantation was killing work. Rice cultivation required enslaved people to stand in water up to their waists for hours, their hands bleeding from handling sharp stalks, their legs swelling from constant immersion. Dysentery, cholera, and malaria swept through the slave quarters with such regularity that Calhoun budgeted for the annual loss of human property the way other planters budgeted for equipment replacement. The overseers who managed this nightmare were expected to extract maximum productivity regardless of human cost, and they were given absolute authority to achieve that goal through any means they deemed necessary. In October of 8 enslaved man arrived at the Calhoun plantation under unusual circumstances. The county records list him only as property transfer, male 28, albino field hand, origin Chatham County. He had no recorded name in any official document. The enslaved community would come to call him Silas, though whether this was a name he chose or one given to him remains unknown. What made Silas remarkable, and what would ultimately make him legendary, was his appearance. Complete albinism was rare among any population, but among enslaved Africans it created a particularly cruel set of circumstances. Silas's skin held no melanin whatsoever. It was pale as candle wax, prone to burning and blistering under the Georgia sun. His eyes were a washed-out blue that watered constantly in daylight, forcing him to illumination that other workers tolerated easily. His hair grew white and fine, nothing like the coarse dark hair typical of his people. This appearance had marked him as cursed or touched by something unnatural in the eyes of both enslaved and enslaver populations throughout his life. The records from Chatham County that accompanied his transfer were sparse but revealing. Silas had been sold 4 times in the previous 6 years, always after incidents described only as difficulties with management or unsuitability for cooperative labor. One notation from 1851 was more specific: subject displays extreme resistance to correction. Previous owner reports 2 overseers injured during discipline attempts, recommends sale to interior plantation where isolation can be maintained. Thomas Greer, the head overseer at the Calhoun plantation, was a man whose reputation preceded him throughout Burke County. At 43 years old, he had spent 2 decades managing enslaved labor across Georgia and South Carolina. He was known for what the planter class euphemistically called firm management, a term that concealed regular beatings, torture of those who worked too slowly, and sexual violence against enslaved women that produced a generation of mixed-race children he never acknowledged. If you're still with us on this dark journey through forgotten history, take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We want to know where our audience is discovering these buried American horrors, and if this story is sending chills down your spine, smash that like button to help others find it too. When Silas arrived at the Calhoun plantation in late October, the assistant ogled to his appearance with immediate derision. One of them, a man named Wade Parsons, declared that Silas looked like something that crawled out of hell wearing the wrong skin. Another, Robert Finch, suggested that his pale appearance made him touched by the devil and predicted he wouldn't last a month in the rice fields. Thomas Greer assigned Silas to the rice fields, the most physically demanding and dangerous work on the plantation. For someone with Silas's condition, this assignment was particularly brutal. His skin, unable to produce protective melanin, burned and blistered within hours of sun exposure. The constant water immersion caused his skin to crack and peel, creating wounds that refused to heal in the humid environment. The first beating occurred during Silas's 3rd day at the plantation, when he failed to complete his assigned section of the rice field before sunset. Greer had him tied to a post near the slave quarters, and delivered 20 lashes, while the other enslaved workers were forced to watch. A standard technique meant to reinforce the consequences of inadequate productivity. What Greer noticed during that first beating was something that should have warned him. Silas made no sound. Most people being whipped screamed, begged, or at least grunted with each strike. Silas remained silent, his pale eyes fixed on some distant point beyond Greer's shoulder. When it was finished and he was cut down, Silas walked back to his quarters without limping or showing any sign of pain, though his back was striped with bleeding welts. During the weeks that followed, several enslaved people noticed that Silas disappeared sometimes during the brief hours between the end of work and the required return to quarters. No one knew where he went, though some reported seeing his pale figure moving toward the cypress groves that bordered the plantation's rice fields. These groves were dangerous territory, dense swampy areas filled with cottonmouth snakes and alligators, places where even experienced woodsmen could become disoriented and lost. The fact that Silas ventured into these areas alone and always returned suggested either recklessness or an intimate knowledge of swamp navigation that seemed impossible for someone who had only recently arrived at the plantation. Christmas week brought a brief respite from labor, a tradition that most planters observed to maintain the illusion of paternalistic benevolence. It was during the enslaved woman named Delilah had a conversation with Silas that she would remember for the rest of her life. Delilah was 52 years old, a cook who had survived 3 decades of bondage through careful observation and strategic silence. She found Silas sitting alone near the quarters, his pale skin stark against the darkness. "They say you've been sold 4 times before coming here," Delilah said, settling herself on the ground near him. "They say you got troubles with overseers wherever you go." Silas didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and measured. "Troubles find me. I don't go looking for them." "That man Greer," Delilah continued, "he's the worst kind. He'll kill you slow if you give him reason." "I seen him do it before. I know what Greer is," Silas said. His pale eyes caught the moonlight, giving them an eerie, reflective quality. "I know what all of them are." "Then you best keep your head down," Delilah advised. "Whatever you're thinking about doing, whatever anger you're carrying, you got to bury it deep. Anger gets us killed." Silas turned to look at her fully for the first time. Maybe, or maybe anger is the only thing that keeps us alive. The first disappearance occurred on January 7, 1854. Wade Parsons, one of the assistant overseers, failed to appear for the morning assembly of enslaved workers. This was unusual because Parsons was known for his punctuality and his enthusiasm for the first beating of the day, which he considered for establishing the proper tone of fear and submission. When Parsons didn't appear by mid-morning, Thomas Greer sent another overseer to check his cabin. The cabin was empty. The bed was unmade and Parsons' coat still hung on its peg near the door, suggesting he hadn't planned to go far. His rifle, which he normally carried everywhere, leaned against the wall. A half-eaten meal sat on the table, the food cold and untouched for hours. Nothing suggested violence or struggle. Parsons simply wasn't there. Greer organized a search party that combed the plantation grounds, the nearby woods and the swamp edges. They found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no signs of an accident. Wade Parsons had simply vanished as thoroughly as if he had never existed. The enslaved population responded to Parsons's disappearance with carefully concealed satisfaction. Parsons had been particularly cruel, and known for whipping enslaved people for the smallest infractions and for targeting young women with sexual violence. His absence was a blessing, though no one dared speak this thought aloud. What they did whisper about in the quiet hours after the overseers had retired was the fact that Silas had been working in a rice field within sight of Parsons's last known location, and that several people had seen Parsons yelling at Silas the afternoon before his disappearance. 3 weeks passed. On February 3rd, Daniel Carmichael, a newly hired overseer, disappeared. The circumstances mirrored Parsons's vanishing so closely that Greer felt genuine alarm for the first time. Carmichael had been supervising work in the rice fields during the afternoon. When the enslaved workers called back to quarters at sunset, Carmichael wasn't with them. A search of his cabin revealed the same details as Parsons's disappearance: a half-eaten meal, personal belongings undisturbed, no signs of violence or struggle. The disappearances created a tension that hung over the Calhoun plantation like humidity before a storm. The remaining overseers began traveling in pairs, unwilling to be alone in areas where enslaved workers were present. They carried their weapons constantly and watched the enslaved population with increased suspicion. Random beatings increased as the overseers attempted to reassert control through intensified violence. On March 19th, 2 overseers disappeared on the same night. Robert Finch and a man named George Talbot had been assigned to night watch duty, a rotation that Greer had implemented after Carmichael's disappearance. When morning came, both men were gone. Their rifles were found leaning against a tree at the edge of the cypress grove, positioned carefully as if someone had placed them there deliberately. Thomas Greer's response revealed the depth of his alarm. He sent an urgent message to Jeremiah Calhoun demanding that the owner return to the plantation immediately. While waiting for Calhoun's arrival, Greer implemented a series of measures designed to prevent further disappearances. All enslaved people were confined to their quarters from sunset to sunrise with armed guards posted at every entrance. Anyone leaving the quarry for any reason would be shot without warning. The overseers worked in groups of 3 or more, never alone. Greer personally interrogated dozens of enslaved people, using torture when he deemed it necessary, trying to extract information about who might be responsible for the disappearances. These interrogations revealed nothing useful. Either the enslaved genuinely knew nothing, or their silence was impenetrable. Jeremiah Calhoun arrived at his plantation on March 25, accompanied by his personal secretary and 2 hired guards. The meeting between Calhoun and Greer took place in the plantation's main house. Greer laid out the facts of the disappearances with military precision: dates, locations, circumstances, and the complete absence of evidence or witnesses. He also shared his growing conviction that someone among the enslaved population was responsible, though he admitted he had no proof and no suspects. "I've managed enslaved people for 20 years, Greer told Calhoun. "I know when they're planning something. There's a feeling in the air, a tension you can sense. But this is different. They're scared, are truly scared. But not of us, they're scared of something else." Instead of bringing in authorities, they agreed to hire additional overseers from outside Burke County, men who wouldn't be aware of the previous disappearances. They would also implement a reward system, offering freedom to any enslaved person who provided information leading to the capture of whoever was responsible. The new overseers arrived in early April, 3 men recruited from rice plantations in South Carolina. Their names were Marcus Sloan, Raymond Dodd, and Henry Fletcher. For 2 weeks, nothing unusual occurred. Then on April 22, Marcus Sloan didn't return from the morning inspection of the rice fields. The discovery of Sloan's disappearance triggered panic among the remaining overseers. The pattern was breaking, as Sloan had disappeared during daylight hours while enslaved workers were present and under supervision. Greer immediately ordered a lockdown of the entire plantation. All work stopped. Every enslaved person was called to the quarters under armed guard. This time, searchers found something. In the cypress grove, approximately half a mile from the rice fields where Sloan had been working, they discovered a clearing that showed signs of recent disturbance. The ground had been torn up in places, and there were marks in the soft earth that might have been drag marks. More disturbing were the marks on several cypress trees, deep gouges in the bark as if something had been scraped against the wood with considerable force. Some of the gouges showed traces of what appeared to be blood. The enslaved population was interrogated again, this time with increased violence. Greer's restraint had eroded completely. Several enslaved people died during these interrogations, their bodies buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the plantation. One interrogation produced an interesting detail. An elderly enslaved man named Caesar mentioned that he had seen Silas near the cypress grove on several occasions, and that he had seen Silas entering the grove after dark during the hours when all enslaved people were supposed to be confined to their quarters. Greer immediately ordered Silas brought to the main house for interrogation. The guards found him in his assigned sleeping area, lying on the rough wooden platform that served as his bed. He offered known his hands when they bound his hands and led him across the plantation grounds. The interrogation took place in a storage shed adjacent to the main house. Silas was stripped to the waist and chained to a post in the center of the shed, his arms pulled above his head in a position designed to cause maximum discomfort. "You've been seen entering the cypress grove at night," Greer began. "Why?" Silas remained silent, his eyes focused on something beyond Greer's shoulder. "5 overseers have disappeared from this plantation in less than 4 months, Greer continued. "You arrived here shortly before the first disappearance. That's an interesting coincidence." Still silence. The beating that followed was systematic and brutal. Silas's back was torn open, a blood running down his pale skin in stark red streams. He made no sound. His eyes never left that distant point he had fixed upon, and his body remained still except for the involuntary jerks caused by the whip's impact. After 20 lashes, Greer stopped and tried questions again. Silas's silence remained absolute. They resumed the whipping, delivering another 20 lashes. Still he made no sound. "He's not human," one of the overseers muttered. "No man can take that without making a sound." Greer tried a different approach. He had hot coals brought from the kitchen fires. The torture that followed involved pressing heated metal against Silas's skin. The smell of burning flesh filled the shed. Silas's pale eyes watered more heavily, but whether from pain or simply from the smoke was impossible to determine. He didn't scream. He didn't speak. He barely moved. After 3 hours, even Calhoun couldn't watch anymore and left the shed. They finally stopped, not because they had gotten information, but because they were physically exhausted and psychologically disturbed by Silas's complete lack of response. They had him dragged back to the slave quarters, unconscious from blood loss and trauma, but somehow still alive. That night, April 22nd, 2 more overseers disappeared. Raymond Dodd and Henry Fletcher, the men who had participated in Silas's torture, were both assigned to guard duty at the main house. At midnight, Dodd called out. Fletcher responded. At 12:15, Dodd called out again. There was no response from Fletcher. They found Fletcher's rifle leaning against the wall of the main house, exactly where he had been standing. His hat lay on the ground nearby. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away. 2 hours later, when they returned to the main house to regroup, they discovered that Raymond Dodd was also gone. 7 white men had now disappeared from the Calhoun plantation in less than 4 months. Dawn on April 23rd revealed a plantation descending into chaos. The remaining white men, Thomas Greer, Jeremiah Calhoun, his secretary, and the 2 hired guards, gathered in the main house and barricaded themselves inside. They were outnumbered by the enslaved population 200 to 5. The enslaved population emerged from their quarters cautiously, uncertain what the new day would bring. The normal routine of forced labor didn't resume, because there was no one to enforce it. For the first time in memory, the enslaved people of the Calhoun plantation experienced a morning without someone telling them what to do. Delilah was one of the first to realize that Silas was missing. His sleeping area in the quarters was empty. The rough blanket that had covered him was soaked with blood from his torture wounds, but without any sign of the man himself. Several people had checked on him during the night. As recently as 4 hours before dawn, someone had seen him lying there, barely conscious but breathing. Now he was gone. Inside the main house, Greer and Calhoun debated their options. The compromise they reached was to send the secretary and 1 guard to Savannah with urgent messages requesting immediate military intervention. The secretary left late in the morning, riding hard for Savannah. That afternoon, Greer made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided to address the enslaved population directly. He had the remaining guard fire several rifle shots into the air to gather the enslaved people. When they had assembled, Greer emerged onto the front porch. "I know someone here knows what's been happening," Greer began. 7 white men have disappeared from this plantation. That can't happen without someone knowing something. I'm offering freedom, legal documented freedom, to anyone who provides information leading to whoever is responsible. The crowd remained silent. If no one comes forward, Greer continued, I'll burn these quarters to the ground with everyone in them. I'll see every last one you dead before I let this plantation fall. You have until sundown to make your choice. As afternoon faded toward evening, a young enslaved man named Caleb approached the main house. Caleb was 16 years old, quick-minded and desperate to escape slavery by any means available. He claimed to have information about the disappearances. I seen something, Caleb said. I seen the pale one, Silas, going into the Cypress grove at night multiple times, and I seen him carrying things. Heavy bundles that he carried over his shoulder. He was heading deep into the swamp where the ground gets too wet for most folks to go. Can you lead us to where he went? Greer asked. Yes, sir, Caleb replied. I can show you the path he took, but we'd need to go before full dark. Greer made his decision quickly. We go now. All of us, Greer, the remaining guard, Patterson and Caleb, prepared for the expedition. They armed themselves with rifles, knives, and a length of rope. As they left the main house, dozens of enslaved people watched from the quarters, their faces unreadable in the fading light. Caleb led them toward the cypress grove, moving with the confident stride of someone who knew the terrain. The path he followed wound between massive cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. The air grew thick with moisture and the smell of decaying vegetation. Water began appearing in pools, then as a continuous shallow layer covering the ground. How much farther? Greer asked after they'd walked for nearly 20 minutes. Not far now, sir. There's a clearing up ahead, maybe 200 yards more. The clearing, when they reached it, was larger than Greer expected. A roughly circular area, perhaps 50 feet across, where the cypress trees gave way to open space. In the center of this clearing stood a structure that made all 3 men stop in their tracks. It was a framework built from cypress branches lashed together with what appeared to be strips of leather. The structure stood about 8 feet tall and formed a rough rectangular shape. Hanging from this framework were 9 objects that Greer's mind initially refused to identify. They swayed slightly in the breeze, and as he forced himself to look more carefully, understanding came with a wave of nausea. They were skins, human skins, stretched and cured like leather hides, still showing the recognizable features of faces, the texture of body hair, the shape of hands and feet. 9 complete human skins carefully preserved and displayed like trophies. Greer recognized Wade Parsons by a distinctive scar on his left arm. Robert Finch's tattoo, an anchor he'd gotten during a brief stint in the Merchant Marine, was clearly visible on one of the suspended skins. The count matched perfectly. 9 overseers, all of them here. Patterson vomited immediately. Caleb stood frozen, his eyes wide with horror. Greer felt his hand shaking as he raised his rifle, scanning the clearing for any sign of threat. We need to leave, Patterson gasped. We need to get out of here right now. Before Greer could respond, Caleb spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. He's here. He's been here the whole time. Greer spun around. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light, stood Silas. His pale skin seemed to glow faintly in the gathering darkness. He was shirtless, his back still showing the raw wounds from yesterday's torture, but he stood upright with no sign of pain or weakness. In his right hand, he held a long knife, the blade catching the last rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy. Put down the knife and surrender, Greer commanded, raising his revolver. Silas didn't move or speak. He simply stood there, watching them with those pale, watery eyes. Patterson raised his rifle as well. Caleb broke first. He turned and ran, splashing back along the path. Greer kept his rifle trained on Silas, who still hadn't moved. I asked you questions yesterday, Greer said, his voice shaking slightly. You didn't answer then. Answer now. Why did you kill them? For the first time since arriving at the Calhoun plantation, Silas spoke. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, with an accent that suggested education unusual for an enslaved person. You already know why. You've always known. That's not an answer, Greer said. It's the only answer. They did what you do. They took what wasn't theirs. They hurt people who couldn't defend themselves. They thought being white and made them untouchable. Silas paused, tilting his head slightly. They were wrong. Patterson fired his rifle. The shot was panicked and poorly aimed, the bullet striking several feet to Silas's left. Before Patterson could reload, Silas moved. The speed of his movement was shocking. One moment standing still at the clearing's edge, the next closing the distance to Patterson in a blur of pale skin and flashing steel. The knife found Patterson's throat with surgical precision. The guard fell, blood pumping from the severed artery, dead before Greer fired his rifle, but Silas had already moved again, circling around the framework of hanging skins. The bullet hit nothing but air. In the failing light and the confused shadows cast by the suspended skins, Silas seemed to disappear and reappear at random. Greer abandoned the rifle and drew his pistol, backing toward the lead out of the clearing. You can't escape, Silas said, his voice seeming to come from multiple directions at once. This grove is mine. I know every path, every sinkhole, every hiding dead. You just haven't stopped moving yet. Greer ran. He crashed through the undergrowth, following what he hoped was the path back to the plantation. Behind him, he could hear splashing footsteps, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always there. The darkness was nearly complete now. He stumbled repeatedly over roots and through hidden pools of water. His lungs burned and his heart hammered in his chest. He realized he was lost. The path had disappeared in the darkness, or he'd strayed from it in his panic. He was surrounded by cypress trees and black water with no clear sense of direction. He stopped, trying to quiet his breathing enough to listen for pursuit. Then he felt something touch his shoulder, just a light pressure, almost gentle. He spun around and saw Silas standing directly behind him, close enough that Greer could see the details of his wounds in the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. Please, Greer whispered, all his authority and cruelty stripped away, leaving only naked fear. Please don't. Silas's pale eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's. Did they say please, the people you beat, the women you violated, the children you sold away from their mothers? Did you stop when they begged? Greer tried to raise his pistol, but his hand wouldn't obey him. Terror had locked his muscles, and he could only stand there as Silas reached forward with the knife. The last thing Thomas Greer saw was his own reflection in those colorless eyes. Caleb burst from the cypress grove in full panic, running toward the main house where Jeremiah Calhoun waited. He pounded on the door, screaming to be let in. Calhoun unbarred the door just long enough for Caleb to tumble inside before slamming and securing it again. What happened? Calhoun demanded. Where's Greer? Where's Patterson? Caleb was hyperventilating, barely able to form words. When he finally managed to speak, the story he told made Calhoun's blood run cold. The clearing, the framework, the skins, the appearance of Silas, and the killing of Patterson before Caleb fled. The night that followed was the longest of Jeremiah Calhoun's life. He sat in the main room with a rifle across his lap, starting at every sound. Around midnight, something scratched at the front door. Just a light sound, like fingernails drawn across wood. It continued for several minutes, then stopped. An hour later it came again, this time at a window. Near dawn, Calhoun heard voices. He recognized them as belonging to enslaved people from the quarters. Multiple individuals engaged in what sounded like excited conversation. He risked a look through the shutters and saw figures moving in the growing light, people gathering near the path that led to the cypress grove. When full dawn arrived, Calhoun finally worked up the courage to open the door. The enslaved population had assembled in the open area between the main house and the quarters, every man, woman, and child on the plantation. They stood in a loose semicircle, all facing the cypress grove path. From the path emerged Silas. He walked slowly, still shirtless, his wounded back visible to everyone. He carried something in his arms, a bundle wrapped in cloth. The crowd parted to let him through, maintaining a respectful distance. He walked to a point about 20 feet from the main house and stopped. Mr. Calhoun, Silas called out. I brought you something. He unwrapped the bundle, revealing Thomas Greer's head. The overseer's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, eyes wide and mouth open as if amid scream. Silas placed it carefully on the ground, then straightened and looked directly at Calhoun. This plantation operated on fear, Silas said. You used fear to control us, to break us, to make us forget we were human. Now you understand what real fear feels like. Every man who tortured us, who violated our women, who separated our families, they all learned the same lesson. A fear is a weapon but can be turned around. Calhoun raised his rifle with shaking hands, pointing it at Silas. The enslaved population stirred uneasily. "You can shoot me," Silas said calmly. "It won't change your up and it won't bring your overseers back. It won't restore your control. This plantation is finished, Mr. Calhoun. You just haven't accepted it yet." For a long moment, Calhoun stood frozen with the rifle aimed at Silas's chest. His finger rested on the trigger. But as he looked at the assembled enslaved people, Calhoun realized the truth of Silas's words. Even if he killed Silas, he was one man facing 200. The illusion of control that had maintained the plantation system was shattered beyond repair. He lowered the rifle. Silas nodded slowly, as if this was the response he'd expected. He turned and walked back toward the cypress grove. The enslaved population watched him go, then slowly began to disperse. But the work didn't resume. Without overseers to enforce it, without the systematic violence that had structured every hour of plantation life, the entire social order had simply stopped functioning. Jeremiah Calhoun's secretary returned that afternoon with a detachment of 20 soldiers from the federal garrison in Savannah, along with the county sheriff and a judge. What they found was a plantation in a state of limbo. The enslaved population remained on the property but performed no work. Calhoun sat on the porch of the main house, rifle across his lap, staring at nothing. The soldiers conduct a search of the plantation, including the cypress grove. They found the clearing with its gruesome framework of preserved human skins. They found Patterson's body near the clearing and Greer's headless corpse deeper in the swamp. The other bodies were never recovered. The skins were removed and burned, and the clearing was abandoned. A manhunt was organized for Silas, with slave patrols and military units combing Burke County and the surrounding areas. They found no trace of him. It was as if he had dissolved into the swamps like morning mist. Some speculated that he died from his torture wounds somewhere deep in the wetlands. Others believed he'd made his way north, joining the thousands of enslaved people who followed the Underground Railroad to freedom. A few whispered that he was still out there in the cypress groves, watching and waiting. The Calhoun plantation never recovered. Without overseers willing to take the position, news of the disappearances had spread throughout Georgia despite Calhoun's attempts at secrecy. Within a year, Calhoun had sold the enslaved people individually to other planters, dispersing them across the South, and abandoned the land itself. The main house was eventually burned. The slave quarters stood empty for decades before finally collapsing. The story of detilated through the enslaved communities of Georgia and beyond, changing with each retelling but maintaining its essential elements. An albino enslaved man, tortured beyond endurance, had hunted and killed 9 white overseers before vanishing into legend. For enslaved people, it was a story of resistance and revenge, a reminder that even the most brutal system contained the seeds of its own destruction. One detail that was left out of most official accounts was discovered by a historian researching Burke County records in the 1920s. Among the documents related to the Calhoun plantation, she found a bill at 1853 for the purchase of an enslaved man from Chatham County. The notation on the sale mentioned that the individual being sold had been trained as a tanner, a person skilled in preserving and preparing animal hides. This single detail suggested a disturbing possibility about why Silas possessed the knowledge necessary to preserve human skins with such skill. The cypress grove where the clearing stood eventually returned to wilderness as the plantation around it was abandoned. Local people avoided the area, claiming it felt wrong somehow. In the 1890s, a logging company attempted to harvest timber from the grove, but workers refused to enter after several men reported seeing a pale figure watching them from between the trees. During the Civil War, the abandoned Calhoun plantation served as a temporary camp for both Confederate and Union forces at different times. Soldiers from both armies reported strange occurrences in the area, unexplained signs from the cypress grove, the sensation of being watched, equipment going missing and then reappearing in unusual locations. One Union officer noted that his men refused to patrol near the grove after dark, claiming they could hear screaming coming from deep within the swamp. In the decades following emancipation, some of the formerly enslaved people from the Calhoun plantation were interviewed as part of various historical documentation projects. Their accounts of the 1853 to 1854 were remarkably consistent in the basic facts, but varied wildly in their interpretation of what Silas had been. Some described as a man driven to justified violence by unbearable cruelty. Others spoke of him in almost mythological terms, as if he had been something more than human, a force of retribution given physical form. One elderly woman interviewed in 1903 stated simply, "Devil's White wasn't no devil. He was what we needed him to be. He was our answer when we couldn't find no other answer." The true fate of Silas remains unknown. Records from northern states contain no clear matches for an albino escaped slave arriving during 1854. Some researchers have speculated that he died from his injuries shortly after leaving the plantation, his body lost in the vast swamps of southeastern Georgia. Others point to occasional reports from subsequent decades, rumors of a pale man seen in swamplands across the South, always appearing in areas where plantation cruelty was particularly severe, always vanishing before authorities could investigate.